Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Today, we're diving into an important conversation on grant funding disparities across New York State. I'm joined by Pamela Ayers, Executive Vice President of Strategic Initiatives at Empreinte Consulting, who has an extensive background in the New York grant funding landscape. She recently published an article on funding disparities and how rural communities and mid-sized cities often miss out. Pamela, thank you for being here with us.
Oh, thanks for having me, Ryan.
Great. To start, I'd love for you to share a little bit about what motivated you to write your recent article on New York's funding disparities. Can you tell us about the big picture that you wanted to spotlight?
Sure. So, interestingly, the thing that got me thinking about this was a piece from Instrumentl that talked about, the way that funding was dispersed and talked about the fact that New York State was the biggest, second biggest, rather, funder in the country among grant funders, California being number one. So that got my mind going as a resident of New York State my whole life. The disparities between what we call in New York State downstate and rest of state are a thing of frequent conversation, and not just in the nonprofit world, but across the board, like at parties and stuff. This comes up all the time. So the most common topic of this ilk is that we rest of staters, I do not live in New York City, find it irritating that people assume you're from New York City when you tell them you're from New York, right? And that often starts a whole thing about how much more there is to our great state than just the most populated city in the country. So I mentioned in my article that we're also home to the largest park in the contiguous U.S., the Adirondacks, which I love. There are 100 towns and villages there. There are over 120,000 residents there. And we don't think of that when we think of New York. And you have places like here in Rochester, where I live, which is a mid-sized city, that's home to some of the most poignant history in America, right? We are home to Frederick Douglass and Susan B. Anthony. And we have some massive business history in Kodak and Bausch and Lomb and Xerox. But so often New York City overshadows all of that cool history and cool stuff that we bring to the table. And with lots of good reason, don't get me wrong. Broadway, everything about New York City, it's a phenomenal place. We go there whenever we can. So nothing against New York City, but like the rest of us matter too. So when I started looking at the Instrumentl data and saw that New York State ranks so high in the country for total grant dollars awarded, it got my wheels turning. And as a grant strategist and advisor and doing this work in New York State for 20 years, I've seen the trends over time, and it's really undeniable that our state has a history of more investment in New York City than the rest of the state, and that's both on the public and the private side. And a lot of that is for good reason, right? The population concentration in New York City warrants that they would have more funding there. But the data, combined with my experience, made me want to dig in more because it seemed like more inequitable than it should be given the population differences as I looked at per capita numbers. So, this is my home and I'm interested in the way things break down here. So I wanted to see what kind of impact all of that was having on the bigger landscape. That's what drove me to write the article and kind of dig into some of the details.
Great. Thank you for that context. Um, Pamela, when we look at the year over year changes in grant funding, we see a pattern of decline for rural counties between 2021 and 2022 specifically. Could you share some of the specific challenges that rural areas face when competing for grants?
Sure. I mean, there are a number of reasons. One of them is limited staff and expertise. So rural communities often have small or part-time or even volunteer staff with limited capacity to research and write good proposals and manage the complex reporting requirements. So too often we see that like the executive team or even like some random board member is taking on the grants work, and they might be great at writing, but they likely don't have the expertise or training that some of us bring to the table, just because we've had more opportunities with larger organizations. They also have challenges with matching funds. So as you know, a lot of grants require a local match, and even if they don't require it, like with private funders, and foundations, we at least know that having other sources identified make for a stronger proposal. So not having that matching funding can be a huge barrier for rural areas that have smaller budgets and like fewer potential funding sources because there's just not as many people there. So smaller populations mean a smaller pool of philanthropists, and then like less likely that you're going to have the match that you need than if you were in a bigger city. And there's also limitations on population size. So I don't love thinking this, but a lot of grants are a lot of opportunities are kind of written for a larger population size. So when you have a small population and the details of a grant opportunity are very specific about who you're allowed to serve, now you might have three of those people. But if you were able to combine all the folks that you're serving with a variety of demographics, then you'd have the full complement of folks that you want served. But these very specific grants don't allow for that diversity. There's also access to technical assistance. So in Rochester, we have a number of consulting firms, and we're a mid-sized city, so more resources than like in the North Country. And so if you're a small rural community, you just don't have access to professional consultants and grant writing workshops and all these extras that you might have in a place that's more densely populated. Those are just a few examples. I could go on and on, but I know we have limited time, so I won't talk all day about it.
No, this is great. To zoom out a little bit and actually look at the regional level, how does the funding imbalance impact different regions differently? For example, what unique challenges do you see in regions like the North County compared to a place like NYC?
Yeah, so you can see there are pretty big tranches of land that are included in each of these regions, and funding imbalances impact them differently because they're very different from one another. Particularly when comparing some place like the North Country with New York City, right? The North Country is a huge park. It's very spread out, and it's so lovely. But there's a lot of open space, right? And New York City is so dense. So in rural areas like the North Country, we see a lot of disparities in healthcare and education and economic development and family support services that stem from that lack of investment that creates barriers that urban areas like New York City don't experience in the same way. So if we take healthcare access as an example, medical deserts, North Country is considered a medical desert where healthcare facilities are really far apart. And that means that residents might have to drive a long ways to get services. They might have to wait forever in the waiting rooms. And they often have to pay higher costs even for basic care just because it's like supply and demand, right? And then they also don't have specialized services. So if they need something really specialized, they may have to travel all the way to Albany to get those. So rural residents really face a gap that could be addressed just through more flexible mobile healthcare options, but those aren't always funded, right? Often when we see grantors wanting to pay for healthcare solutions, they're looking to support hospitals. They're not looking to support a van that can go out into the country and take care of people's needs. You know, the same goes for education, which also suffers from underfunding. And believe me, I know that it's underfunded across the board, but it hits rural areas differently and small cities too, because they also often lack up-to-date resources. They don't have the same access to data and technology. They might not have the same advanced courses, especially if their schools have a small population of students. And even programs like those extras, which aren't really extra, but art and music just aren't as available in the rural communities as they are in urban centers. And in rural communities, they don't have the chance to collaborate with as many local organizations. So I can say here in Rochester, our city school district has a lot of push-in supports from local organizations, which are often given to them for free because those organizations have the funding to support going in and doing that. And that just isn't happening so much in rural communities. One other thing is childcare deserts. I talk about childcare deserts in my article. So this is where you just have not enough childcare providers for the number of people in need. And in the North Country and other rural communities, affordable childcare options are really, really limited, if not non-existent. And so that results in people either having to drive a long way or pay a lot of money or not working because it's more expensive to have their kid in childcare than to just be home with them. And it's just an unfair disadvantage that rural communities have just because of proximity.
Hmm. Yeah. Pam, despite these funding challenges, are there any unique opportunities or strengths that nonprofits in rural areas like North County or Mohawk Valley or the Southern Tier, are there any opportunities or strengths that they might have that their urban counterparts might not?
Yeah, and I cannot talk about collaboration enough, so I'm just going to put that out there, and I'll probably talk about it 50 million times. Um, but rural areas have some really amazing resources, like natural resources, um, timber, minerals, or agriculture, even renewable energy, like wind and solar, you see more in rural communities. These provide an opportunity for some really cool collaborations with local industries in ways that can benefit both ways. So in more rural communities, partnering with agriculture and renewable energy sectors, for instance, can support sustainable practices and create jobs and generate revenue streams for the local economy. And sometimes those business partners might even be willing to invest or might be able to influence donors or draw down funding in ways that a nonprofit might not be able to access. Generally, and I know this is a very big overgeneralization, but generally the cost of living in rural communities is better than that of New York City, right? So for nonprofits, this translates into more affordable operational costs, which can allow them to allocate more of their budget to program and services. Even like rent, utilities, staffing costs can all be lower, which means that rural nonprofits have more opportunity to be efficient with every dollar that they raise, which can be a good incentive for funders because the funder can see that they get more bang for their buck. So talking about that kind of out loud, I think is a really good opportunity for rural communities. I can't say enough about the slow pace of life and the strong sense of connection that we probably all have experienced going into a small town or rural community. It's one of the things that always draws us up to the Adirondacks, right? It's just such a lovely environment. Those close-knit relationships and community spirit can be really powerful assets for nonprofits that I don't know that you always have in big cities, which are hustling and bustling and not so familiar with each other. So I love how rural communities have a different level of trust, encourage more volunteerism among their community members, and really have longer term engagement. So when you think about donor relations, there's a lot of promise there with those that do have the means to give.
These are all great insights. I'd like to take a step back from the nonprofits and actually talk about grant makers for a second. Have you observed any trends or shifts in grant making that are beginning to address some of these geographic disparities?
I have, and it makes me excited. So I'm going to preface this by saying don't quote me on anything because, as we all know, the political landscape in the U.S. is shifting very soon. And so a lot remains to be seen, but I'm very hopeful that some trends are going to continue, and these are really jazzing me up. So over the past few years, the philanthropic landscape has seen a big shift, obviously, toward prioritizing equity and grant making. And that's both on the public and the private sides. So there are concerted efforts toward addressing geographic and demographic disparities. It's part of a larger ongoing movement to support historically underserved communities, and that includes rural communities as well as communities of color and those experiencing persistent poverty. So a good example of this is an executive order that was issued by the Biden administration in January of 2021. It directed federal agencies that they had to release an annual equity action plan every year that outlines specific steps to ensure fair treatment of individuals and communities in the federal funding processes. And so as part of that plan, agencies have started to look at their grant eligibility requirements, which is really exciting, and also simplifying application processes. And I'll say if the feds can figure out how to do it, then private funders can figure out how to do it. And they're also looking at providing technical assistance, which I mentioned before is a big lack in rural communities, just to broaden access for smaller organizations, especially those in rural communities. And this kind of promotes all those kinds of equity, like distributional, which means everybody has access to the same resources, the procedural equity, which helps to make sure processes are fair, and then structural equity to make sure that the underlying systems are fair, which is policies and laws. So we know that takes a long time to change, but at least they're paying attention to it. Beyond federal, I think it's important to note that a lot of foundations, sometimes I'm critical of private foundations and how they do stuff, but they've stepped up in their equity commitments. And you might remember in 20 or in the COVID days, we'll call them COVID days, we had like kind of the dual crisis, right? COVID and the national reckoning on racial justice. More than 800 foundations joined the Council on Foundations at that time and took the COVID-19 pledge to ease restrictions on their grants. And that was out of a recognition for the urgent needs to just get the money out and like get rid of some of that red tape. And a lot of funders have seemed to continue these practices. Like they haven't gone back to the old way, or if they have, it's not as far back, which is good. And the other two really promising trends that I talk about in my article are place-based grant making and participatory grant making. Place-based is focused on supporting the sort of holistic needs of an area or specific community. And participatory, which is my favorite, really transfers decision-making power to the community being funded. So it invites real participation from residents in the process, including making final funding decisions. So I love that this shifts like the power dynamic from this power over vibe that we've seen in historic grant making to a real power with, or even a power to dynamic with communities that have traditionally been overlooked or like just ignored by the grant making process. That's maybe the most exciting to me. I think all of these trends are hopeful responses to longstanding inequities, but and I think they're going to take some time. So I'm not saying all of this will take hold tomorrow, but I think it's definitely something that we should keep eyes on.
Hmm. These are great trends to be aware of. Let's switch gears to talk about urban nonprofits. When we look at the number of grants awarded in places like New York City and other urban counties, unsurprisingly, they're the ones leading the way in the total number of grants awarded. Um, for these urban-based nonprofits, they likely struggle with higher competition for grants because of the density of the areas, as well as just the number of grants available for different reasons. What would your recommendation be for these urban nonprofits? How do they stand out? How do they win and access all of these grants?
So I've already said that one of my favorite things to talk about is collaboration. But in many urban centers, and honestly, even mid-sized cities like here in Rochester and in Buffalo, we're service rich. I can't tell you how often we hear that in Rochester. We're service rich community. And I'm not trying to say that all the solutions are there and we just need to tap them correctly. But I do see that denser communities often have a good amount of social care happening. It's not like it's not there. But there also tends to be a duplication of services, partly because we don't know it exists. So we just, oh, this seems like a gap, so I'll just stand up a nonprofit. Or because we don't think one's doing a good enough job, or for whatever reason. Identifying what your organization's unique value proposition is while recognizing that not everything can be your niche. To me, that's a game changer. I've said for years that we shouldn't be about conglomeration in nonprofit. We should be about partnership. And I've seen this done really well in some communities where they've made concerted efforts to create a cooperative system of care across the community. And I don't know anymore, but I know back in the day when I was working at one of my previous employers, we worked with Syracuse quite a lot, and they had a great system of care. And they were not afraid to say, that's not what I do, but this organization does that, so they should go for that grant. And I love that spirit. I think, my ultimate advice about being more competitive, honestly, I hate the term competitive in nonprofit space, but I know it's a reality. How about my advice to stand out, as you put it? Is to really get honest about who your organization is, identify your key strengths, and figure out how you're different, and then make friends with those that do their thing really well too, and fill your gaps and complement what you're doing. Because these collaborations are the future, and you see more and more that funders, if they're not requiring collaborations, are at least strongly suggesting collaborations, and seem to be trending toward giving more funding to collaborative efforts.
This is great. This is great advice. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
In an ideal scenario, Pam, what changes would you like to see in how grant funding is distributed across New York State? Specifically, what steps could be taken by funders to address these disparities in some of the per capita funding we see for some of these lowest lowest per capita in grant awards for these counties.
So just to be clear, you said in an ideal scenario, right?
I did.
So ideally, um, I think grant funding across the state would be distributed with a more tailored approach, looking at the distinct needs and strengths of each region. I think the reality is, and I know you asked ideally, but the reality is a lot of funders are located in New York City and care about New York City, so they're not going to look at the whole state. But I think if we could see some more large grantors looking at the state as a whole and looking at the distinct needs of each region, and then rather than a one size fits all model, looking at what each area's challenges are, whether it's healthcare in rural areas or educational resources in like Rochester or infrastructure, whatever it is, really looking at what those particular regions are suffering or struggling with and attending to that in their grant making. I feel like it's very easy to put out sort of your generalized priorities and then not realize that those priorities don't fit for a lot of the state. So I'd really like to see some of that more individualized grant making, or really at least considering the place-based approach, if not, a full participatory approach.
This is great to know. And this, at the risk of having you repeat yourself a little, just for advice for nonprofits, what advice would you give to a nonprofit that was in a place like Wyoming County or Orleans County and these low per capita counties? What advice would you give to them if they're looking to kind of overcome the challenges that they're up against in these counties?
Yeah, so I mean, a few things. And I mentioned earlier the strengths of rural communities, and I think optimizing that. So, funders, especially those bigger ones, they often don't even know every part of the state or region, right? Lots of people don't even know there are these economic development regions in New York State. And they don't know anything other than maybe where they're located. So I think it's really important for nonprofits to highlight the unique assets and potential that their area has, not just their organization. And also, a lot of funders respond really well to initiatives that show strong community identity and that leverage local resources, which are both strengths I mentioned earlier. So have a clear description of that in your bag of tricks, right? Be ready to throw that in as part of your elevator pitch, that not only is our organization awesome, but our community is awesome. And here's the stuff that we're leveraging as we're doing our work. And I can't say enough about partnerships. I'm going to say it again. Finding your nonprofit, but also business and government agency partners, university partners, if you have colleges and universities nearby, that increases your reach and funding potential, right? There are lots of grants that only educational entities can go for, so partner with them and be their service provider or partner. I think collaboration demonstrates to funders that you're willing to pool resources, you're willing to share expertise, you're willing to do what it takes to have a bigger impact. And I just think joint proposals and cross-region partnership help secure larger grants in general. So I think that, this idea of collaboration can just weave through this whole thing, right? And I think also play up that cost of living that I talked about earlier. So highlight the efficiency of your organization, how the lower cost of living in your community helps every dollar go further. So if you emphasize that with your funders, I think that it has a really big impact for, they see that they can have a really big impact for relatively small investment. And a lot of funders love that. And the last thing I'll say is, I know it can be scary, but engage your local government officials. There's a lot of opportunity if you get in to have good relationships with your government officials and other community leaders, where those regional influencers can kind of advocate on your behalf for your mission. And when they're aware of your work, they might be able to connect you with funding opportunities you didn't even know were there.
This is great. All this advice has been great, and I think it bears repeating to make sure that it really gets out there. Pamela, this conversation has been incredibly enlightening for nonprofits in a really practical way. I have one last question for you. What trends or changes would you encourage nonprofits and funders to watch for in the new year? I know you mentioned a lot of changes going on in the US right now. Are there any other trends that we should be looking out for?
Yeah, a few. So One, I don't think, and I'm not a prognosticator, but I don't think that despite the shifting political landscape, that equity and inclusion as an important concept or value is going anywhere. I think it's going to stay a big priority for a lot of funders, recognizing the need to support marginalized communities. A lot of foundations have updated their priorities recently to bake those things into their values. So I just think as an organization, it's important for folks to be prepared to articulate how they address inequities and advance social justice agendas or goals, even if yours isn't a traditional social justice organization. I just think that that thinking isn't going anywhere. At least I hope I'm right. Also, data is really huge. So data-driven decision making we hear about all the time. It's strongly taken hold across public funding and increasingly in foundation funding, which means both on the side of wanting to see applicants with measurable outcomes, but also in using data to guide their own decisions and who to fund. So it also applies to like deciding on awards and tracking long-term outcomes. And funders really want to be able to say, of the 20 organizations we supported, we achieved these outcomes. They want to claim that success with you. So be building your capacity to collect and analyze and report on data that demonstrates more than just outputs. So beyond just we held so many number of sessions, but look at impact outcomes like so many kids participating in the program achieved whatever improved scores in core subjects, for instance. You really want to be able to say we're achieving these impacts, not just doing these things. And another thing I love to talk about, because it's exciting, and I have two of these at home, Gen Z is a big trend as they're moving into adulthood. And I think the oldest Gen Zers right now are like 27. We're seeing them on foundation boards, especially family foundations, where they're the next gen of philanthropists in the family. And I love that as a cohort, Gen Z has a reputation of being passionate and generous and speaking with their wallet by supporting businesses and other causes that align with their values. And at the same time, Gen Z is the first fully digital native generation. And this means that their giving comes differently. So crypto giving is bigger among Gen Z. Interestingly, for a webinar I just did, I learned that by 2021, the US saw over $500 million in cryptocurrency donations with an average gift size of $5,000 to $15,000. But if you're an organization that doesn't have a mechanism to receive crypto, then you're going to miss out. And you can Google it. I could do a little course, but you could Google it. It's pretty easy to figure out what kinds of technology you need to make that happen on your website. But I encourage people to look into it. And be savvy about text messaging and using different social media outlets, because that's how Gen Z engages. If you don't have a TikTok account, maybe figure that out. I don't know. But Gen Z engages with their causes very differently. And I think it's important for us to be aware of that.
These are all fantastic tips. As a Gen Z myself, I think I need to get on the crypto train. I'm
Come
not
on,
on it
Ryan.
right now. Thank you, Pamela. This has been a really insightful conversation today. It's given us a lot to think about, and I'm sure the nonprofits in New York as well, and even outside, I think a lot of the advice is applicable everywhere.
Yeah.
For viewers, if you'd like to dig deeper into this topic, you can access the full report on Instrumentl's website, where we've provided a comprehensive overview of New York's grant funding landscape. You can also find a link to Pamela's article there to go deeper. Pamela, thank you again for joining us and for all the work that you're doing to highlight these disparities and advocate for equitable solutions. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Ryan. This was fun.
Awesome. Can I ask right before we end things off, how can people connect with you?
Oh, sure. You can reach out to me at my work email, which is Pam Ayers, Pamayers, at empreintconsulting.com. I'm sure Empreint's probably written somewhere on the slides, but so I won't spell it. But that would be a good way, or you can always give me a call at 585-353-1111.
Sounds good. Easy number to remember.
I know,
Thanks again, Pam.
seriously.
It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks.